Welcome back to Dylan Pickups blog. So this week we're doing a short series of videos on guitar setup. Yesterday was setting your neck relief and kind of the first baseline measurement you do. You can check that video out. Today we're going to talk about string height and how to set that and a couple of different styles and why and this and that. So let's just get right into it. String height is pretty important, and after the neck relief is set, it's probably the next thing you want to measure. On most guitars, when the nut is already cut, and you're just trying to dial in your setup, you skip really having anything to do with the nut, except for the first thing I do when I do any kind of string height adjustment is to tune the guitar to pitch, obviously, make sure it's the tension and everything is cool. Double check your string relief or your neck relief first. You can refer to yesterday's video about that. And then I go ahead and capo the first fret. That'll take any inaccuracies that the nut may have that we'll get to tomorrow out of it, and it'll help us to dial this whole thing in. So I throw a capo on the first fret, and then I come down here. So if our 12th fret is here, then your 17th fret, whatever, depending on whatever the scale of the guitar is. I can't draw very well. So somewhere in here. Then what we're going to do is we're going to check our string height off of the top of the fret. So put whatever measuring device, and we'll talk about those in a minute, on the top of this fret, the 17th fret. And measure to the bottom of, I use the low E string. And what you can do is measure the low E string and then the high E string. That's usually what I do. Measure both of those. Now, how far should it be? For today's purposes, I'm going to use kind of the middle of the road spec for a Fender Telecaster, and that is 2 millimeters. That gets you kind of somewhere in the ballpark. Every guitar is a little bit different. Check the factory setup specs for your guitar and find out what that string height is supposed to be. I will tell you that there are some factory specs that measure it at the 12th fret, but most at the 17th. So why do we check our low E and our high E? Because the eventual goal here is that we don't want to basically have the strings go across the neck in a flat line. We want them to follow the radius of the fretboard. So if you have a 7 1/4 radius, or if you have a 10-inch radius, or a 12-inch radius, or 16, which is very flat, you want this to follow it. Why is that? Because if these strings were completely flat across, then in order for you to have the action low enough on the sides, they would be buzzing and hitting in the middle. If you raised them up and had them completely flat so that the middle wouldn't buzz, then the sides, the low E and the high E would be wicked high. So what we want it to do is follow that radius of that fretboard. How do we do that? Well, set your low E and your high E. This is one way to do it. Set your low E and your high E, and then use, if you've seen these pieces of paper or cardboard or plexiglass, this is called a radius gauge, and it'll have 10, 12, 7 1/4, whatever it is, 9, all written on there, and you can set that on top of the strings right here. And after these two are set to whatever height you want them, we'll say 2 millimeters for our example today, then you can just make the shape of the strings in the middle match whatever that radius is, and you should be pretty close. Another way to do it is they have these ones that go underneath the string, okay? And you do the same thing. You set the low E and the high E, and then you make the middles match. The cool part about doing it this way is it doesn't take into consideration, or it does take into consideration, the string gauges, you know, because you have a heavy string on one side and a thin string on the other side. Plus, if you have heavier strings, like heavy set of strings, like a, you know, a 52 low E versus a 48 low E, then the distance from the top of the fret to the bottom of the string remains the same no matter how thick the strings are. So that's a cool way to do it. You do kind of have to compensate for that when you're using this style of radius gauge. So the other way to do it actually is, if you've ever seen some of them kind of look like a credit card, some of them are a ruler, you know, it doesn't really matter, but it'll have like measurements in thousandths of an inch over here, or fractional inches, and it'll have millimeters over here, and then maybe it'll have like notches like this so that you can see how tall it is. The one I use is kind of like a credit card, and it has all these measurements on it, and I actually just set it across the frets up here on the 17th fret, and I can look at those various measurements and I can pick those. The cool part about doing it that way is, as you set it across the fretboard, it automatically, no matter what your fretboard radius is, it automatically, since it's following the shape of the fret, when you put it on top of there, you do one string, then you lift it up and do the next string, lift it up, do the next string, and it will automatically follow the radius of the fretboard as you do that. That's my favorite way of doing it. It takes a little longer that way, and then to be kind of anal, I will check it in a couple other places, because I kind of get a feel for how it's supposed to be in a couple of other places, and it helps me at the same time to straight edge some frets, and you know, I double check a couple other things while I'm doing it. But that's the way I like to do it. In our printed version of this blog today, I will include a printable radius gauge of this type, and then I will also include a printable measuring card. You could print it out like on cardstock. The only thing I would caution you on that is they're free, so it's awesome, but if you print these out, just make sure you follow the directions and measure it like with a ruler before you use it, because if your printer's like not to scale or whatever, then all the measurements will be off. So just make sure that you do that, but I'll go ahead and include that so you can download those and use those for free, which is pretty cool. So let's talk about a couple of different bridge types and how things affect what. This is over here my simply pictured vintage style an early Telecaster saddle, where you have two strings on one bar with an adjuster screw on both sides. You basically just put an Allen key, or whatever it's usually an Allen key. Put it in there and do it to turn it to raise and lower it. The only thing you got to remember with these ones is, since it's on one bar, and we'll get to this when we talk about intonation some more, but because it's on one bar, when you raise one side, the other side will move a little bit, so you might have to like make sure you kind of do them both at the same time. If you're doing it this way, it doesn't much matter, or using one of these radius gauges, it doesn't much matter, because you can just kind of raise and lower until they hit the cardboard. The way I do it, I kind of have to go back and forth between the two to make sure that the measurement stays the same, because just the mechanics of it, one will raise the other or lower the other just a touch. This is like this is like most modern bridges right here. I drew a Telecaster one, you know, a modern Telecaster saddle, but that's how they look. But most bridges work in the same fashion. There will be one screw on either side, screw coming out of the middle. You do it 6 times, and it's pretty easy. The only thing to caution you on this particular one is if you raise one up higher than the other, and that bridge saddle ends up being kind of on an angle, you know, with one screw way here and one screw here. Because, you know, you're following the radius of the fretboard, and if you don't do these evenly, what can happen is, like if it's in this position right here, and this screw is way down and this screw is way up, it'll actually tilt this enough to where you might be able to feel that in your string spacing, like move the string, it'll tilt it like this and then move the string closer to the next one. And that's a really irritating feeling when your string spacing isn't correct. So just keep an eye on that when you do that to keep them level as they go up and down. Here is a Tunomatic. This is going to be a case where for most people who do not have files and other tools, they're going to be kind of the most limited in how you adjust this. Basically, you're going to use a string, a radius gauge, something like this. You're probably going to find the radius of the fretboard. It's probably going to be 10 or 12, somewhere in that area. You're going to set it on top of the strings and see if it matches, and it's probably not going to be 100% perfect. It might be. Probably the most basic way to adjust a Tunomatic, really though, is to use a card like this, or even a caliper or something, and set your low E and your high E off of the 17th fret, and then your middle ones are going to kind of just be what they are. If you want to set them correctly, then you will have to get a set of fret files and file the notches in the tops of each of these saddles so that they are to the measurement that you desire. Otherwise, you're kind of just stuck with adjusting the thumb wheels on both ends to getting the ends correct and then going with whatever the middle is. If you want to try this and get fret files and do it, or even some small jeweler's files sometimes work depending on how pointed they are, you can try this. Fortunately, these little saddles are not that expensive, so I mean, try it. If you mess them up, just get some more. They're not that expensive to swap out and replace if need be. But if you really want to dial it in, you set the ends. You just do the same thing we're doing with everything else, but the way you adjust the middles is with a file. If it's too tall. If it's too short, then you would actually have to raise the whole thing up and then lower the ones that are then too high after it's raised up. So this is a little bit more limited unless you get into the fret file situation. The one thing I will say about all these measurements and all these adjustments, it's going to screw with your intonation. So make sure that you do this before you do your fine-tune intonation, which we will get to day after tomorrow. So that's basically it. Remember that we want to follow. So before we finish today, remember that these measurements that you get out of books and that you see on the internet are basically baselines. I use 2 millimeters at the 17th fret. Actually, I start with 2 millimeters, then I go to 1.75, and then I go to 1.50 if I can get away with it. But I don't do that completely linear either. What I do when I adjust it is my high E, my B, and my G are lower. They kind of get a little bit taller as they go this way, and then my D, A, and E, they kind of get a little bit taller away from the fretboard as they go this way. Obviously, I make this as even as possible. I'm not drawing it correctly. I make it go like this, but I basically kind of make it taper up just a touch as we get to the top. Why do I do that? Because the low E moves more, and depending on how you play, you might rattle that string if you put it down. You know, you might be able to get away with 1.5 millimeters on your high E, your B, and your G, and that'll feel really nice. And then gradually raise it, let's say 175, 175, maybe somewhere between 175 and 2 on your low E, so that you can really chunk on that thing and not rattle it against the fretboard. Like I said, that 2 millimeters or that 1.75 or whatever is in your book for your particular, whatever is in the book for your particular guitar brand and build and style are really just a baseline. Once you get that baseline set, then start playing with it. You know, if you feel like you can get it a little bit lower without fret buzz, or there's always going to be a little bit of fret buzz, especially when you play really hard. You can get it to where there isn't any, but if you can put up with a little bit, you can get a lot lower action sometimes. So play around with it. This is a measurement that is very easy to play with, provided that your neck relief is correct. So go back to yesterday's video, make sure that your neck relief is correct first, and then play with your string height at the 17th fret with your saddle height. It will mess with your intonation, but don't worry about that. We're going to talk about that in a couple of days, and everybody is scared of intonation, but it's not that hard. So we will do that, and if you have any other questions, if you watch this blog and it makes you think of something and you have a question that you want us to address, please let us know. Otherwise, we will talk to you tomorrow, and thanks for stopping by.